Hello folks, the White Guy here again. Welcome to my home on this very beautiful autumn morning. The name of this video is called The White Guy Exposes How Christendom is Taking the Wide Path. Okay, what do I mean by that? Is my wonderful wife, she came up with the idea of me referring to the theme, of me doing a video, that's referring to the theme of a narrow gate or a narrow path versus a wide one that leads to destruction. Are we familiar with that verse? Quote, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it, for the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it." Close quote. That's in Matthew. Jesus is speaking in Matthew 7:13 and 14. You know, for possibly hundreds of years, these passages, they've been used and abused by the clergy to strike fear into their audience. They use this as a threat. Okay? So, what my wisdom-filled wife said to me when she brought this up, it puts these two passages into the correct perspective, in my opinion. And I'd like to share some of her thoughts, along with some of mine, about the irony of how these Matthew verses are, and how these verses are understood and erroneously taught. Most definitely. Okay? It's understood and taught by Christendom that the narrow path to heaven is only through a belief in Jesus. I find it interesting that neither Jesus' name was mentioned. Of course, he was speaking, of course not. But the words hell, nor heaven, nor eternity wasn't mentioned at all within context. Okay? But anywhere from these passages. But get this, the context, though, this is what's so ironic. The context is about how people treat each other. That's all it's about, which has absolutely nothing to do with what is being taught about heaven, hell, and eternity. As far as a narrow path, wide path, blah, one leads to destruction. Destruction must mean hell. You see the conclusions jump to? And yet they completely ignore the verse. It's just right before it in verse 12. It says, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. For this is the law and the prophets." Close quote. How can you not see that? It's so obvious. The verse right before. The ones they used to threaten you with hell with and eternity and... See? Jesus was just being so practical here. Simply put, if you treat people like crap, which is commonplace, which is a wide path, because it's so commonplace, that unfortunately most people take, then it will lead to destruction. No doubt about it. And I'll explain that destruction in a moment. Think about how very few, as Jesus said, that is narrow and few find it. So think about how very few take the narrow path of love in comparison to the other. That leads to life. And I'll explain what kind of life. To a vivified life. A quality of life, an aeonian life for everyone involved. Believer and unbeliever alike. Okay? This is the salvation that is promised to us if we choose to take the narrow gate. Now let's take a closer look at the wide gate for just a moment. I could write a fourth book titled The Wide Gate of Christendom. I doubt that'll ever happen, but because there are so many divergences now in modern Christianity from what Christ taught. You could write so many books about it, but I don't want to discourage anybody any further, okay? Because Christians are wonderful people, all right? And I'm not saying that to patronize. I believe that with all my heart. All right, but besides, think about it this way. It's only a matter of time before God wakes us all up to the truth of his narrow path of love. So it kind of makes everything moot. Everything that I'm sharing, moot. So why are you even watching this? Just kidding. Anyway, that's really good. That's good news, folks, that it's only going to be a matter of time. However, allow me to offer about 9 of many examples, actually it's going to be more than 9, but you'll understand, exposing how Christianity is taking the wide path. Okay, this one's going to be the longest one, and the first one of how Christianity's taken the wide path is due to a belief in hell. It's a wide gate that the majority are walking through, and the narrow gate of love has absolutely nothing to do with such a belief as that. It doesn't make sense. Can a hell believer give me a loving purpose for the existence of hell? I didn't think so. What's worse, and in context of what Jesus said, the way hell believers treat the unbeliever with the threat of hell makes it abundantly clear that most Christians are not taking the narrow path of love, but instead they choose to take the wide path that leads to destruction. And here's where I want to explain destruction. A destruction in relationships. Okay, caused by judgment of someone's worth. In other words, an unbeliever is somewhat worthless, both in the eyes of God and the average Christian. Unless though, let's put a caveat on there according to Christendom, unless that worthless person, who's absolutely worthless, okay, that worthless individual corrects the problem themselves via the choices that they make. You know, they'd have to be worthless because God wouldn't throw anyone of value into hell now, would he? A destruction of peace. For peace about what? For the outcome of the majority of mankind, because it's taught that the majority of mankind is going straight to hell. Okay, so much for that peace, huh? A destruction, a nullification of the completed victorious work of Christ. It's a destruction of trusting in God to reconcile all of creation. Simply put, a destruction of the fruit of God's Spirit in people's lives, both for the believer and unbeliever alike. And yes, unbelievers have the fruit of God's Spirit in their lives too, folks. That should tell you something. Yes, a belief in hell leads to destruction and produces nothing but bad fruit. Yet the average Christian still insists on drinking that doctrine hell Kool-Aid, or hell doctrine Kool-Aid. Anyway, that was the longest one. Here's number 2. They're going to be shorter from here on out. A belief, and how is Christendom taking the wide path? A belief in devils and demons is the wide gate that the majority of Christians are walking through. You know, there's no loving purpose for such beliefs. Almost all religions believe in such entities, okay? And the phrase, all religions, is simply another way of saying wide path, right? Okay, 3. The narrow path of Jesus is the narrow path that Jesus offers is an abundant life. So there's no way a person can have an abundant life while constantly, metaphorically speaking, looking over their spiritual shoulder, I guess, for an invisible enemy who apparently wants nothing but to inflict harm to his victim. You know, this wide path endorses and describes paranoia more than anything else to me. Second set of notes. If I don't cover up the camera lens. I had to redo this video once because I ended up covering up the camera lens with my notes. 4th way that they're taking the wide path. The promises of Jesus is the narrow path, but few believe those promises. A promise that Jesus said in John 12:32, quote, "And if I am lifted up from the earth, I'll draw all men to myself," close quote. Yet the wide consensus, the wide path, okay, the wide gate of Christendom ignores how Jesus said, all men, right? And they change it in their minds to only those who, ... You fill in the blank, right? The promises, and here's 4.1, okay? The promises of Jesus is the narrow path, but few believe in them. A promise that Jesus said in John 3:17, quote, "For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world would be saved through him," close quote. Unfortunately, the wide path of Christianity claims the exact opposite, pathetically, that Jesus is going to judge the world and condemn those who didn't believe in him. I know I'm not wrong about this. Here's 4.2, The promises of Jesus is the narrow path, but few believe in these promises. To confirm what Jesus said in that John 3:17 passage I just quoted, Jesus also promised in John 12:47, quote, "If anyone hears my sayings and does not keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world," close quote. But once again, the wide path of Christianity states the exact opposite, that Jesus is going to judge the world for not heeding to what he said. 5. The narrow path portrayed by Paul in Corinthians 5:22, where Paul says, quote, "As in Adam all die, or all are dying, thus also in Christ shall all be vivified." All right? Yet everyone in his own order, but the wide path, but everyone in his own order, close quote. But the wide path, folks, is the wide path constructed by doctrines of men make 2 huge mistakes, all right? One, when referring to the death caused by Adam, is promoted and taught as an eternal death. Yet, in all practicality, everyone eventually dies, and that's all that this verse meant. And the second huge mistake is how the word everyone and or all is completely ignored, resulting in how Christendom makes this passage conditional upon, and then once again you can fill in the blanks depending on what kind of church you go to. They make it conditional upon things, and that's never mentioned in context. That's weird, okay? The Corinthians passage is confirmed by 1 Timothy 2:6, where it says, quote, who gave himself a ransom for all to be testified in due time. Last set of notes. Close quote, in due time. The wide path completely disregards the for all statement that was in that 1 Timothy passage, and it limits God to whatever lifetime we happen to be living in. And last set of notes, here we go. 6, the narrow path exalts. The narrow path, remember? The narrow gate, it exalts an eternal God that is not limited by time or death. And as beautifully talked about, spoken about, now this is in context to unbelievers in the Old Testament, but still Peter made it pretty clear in 1 Peter 4:6, quote, for the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit according to the will of God, close quote. You know, the wide path teaches that this little short lifetime is our only opportunity to know God. The opposite of what Peter said. Okay. 7, the wide path of Christianity teaches us that by our personal believing in what Jesus did at the crucifixion is what cancels the debt of sin that is held against us. That's what the wide path teaches. That's what I was raised on. But the narrow path that Paul points out claims that it was Christ and him alone, okay, who, quote, canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross, close quote. That's Colossians 2:14. Simply put, most Christians want to take the credit for what Jesus did. And how do they take the credit? I believed, and that's what got me in the door. I confessed my sins. That's what gave me salvation. I got baptized. I said the sinner's prayer. I could go on and on. But it's Christ and Christ alone. That's the narrow path, okay? So our personal beliefs, folks, have absolutely nothing to do with what Jesus did. Nothing at all. Yes, it gives us a life, a vivified life in the here and now, but Jesus took care of the not here and now as well as the here and now, come to think of it. The truth of that our belief has nothing to do with it is confirmed in, and here's 8, Romans 3:3. Paul says, quote, what then if some did not believe? Their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? May it never be. Rather, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar, close quote. The wide path that states otherwise is a lie from religiously ignorant people that are liars, according to Paul. Lastly, 9, the wide path that most Christians are led to blindly walk, or the wide gate that they're so blindly walking through, is to believe that only Christians belong to God's exclusive holy club, and that they alone are recipients of God's salvation. The narrow path, spoken by Paul in 1 Timothy 4:10, includes all men, which would obviously include believers as well. Did you notice how I put it that way? Quote, for it is for this we labor and strive, because we have fixed our hope on the living God, who is the Savior of all men, especially believers. That word especially, it means exactly what it says in English, and it's malista in the Koine Greek, M-A-L-I-S-T-A. It doesn't mean only or exclusive at all. Look it up. Prove me wrong. And in closing this video, people can't dance around this passage. Anyway, only a deceived, spiritually blind person couldn't see something as clear as that passage, especially believers. So please, folks, take the narrow path. that leads to life, and life more abundantly. And if your church or if your beliefs are taking the wide path, get off that path as quick as you can. And how do you know if the path is right or wrong? By the fruit that it produces. It's got to produce the fruit of the Spirit in order to be the narrow path. As well as a narrow path complements God's loving nature. Okay? And the wide path complements our not so loving nature so often. Anyway, scroll down, see the Show Me More section. I think I've spoke long enough. And did you remember to do this on this video? This right here. Just a reminder. I won't say it again. Thank you for viewing.